She was just a Jewish girl from the suburbs who fell in love with the wrong man. Or was it the right one? Karen Hill didn't choose the mob life. The mob life chose her. And for 25 years, she lived in a world of cash, cocaine, luxury cars, and constant fear. This is her story. From the glamorous high points to the terrifying fall and the witness protection program that would change everything forever. Before we start Karen's amazing journey, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? If you're getting ready for this full story, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this with anyone who loves true crime and mob stories. This is the full story, and one that the movies couldn't completely tell. The one that covers decades of secrets, survival, and the impossible price of love. Now let's begin. The year was 1965, and America was changing. The Beatles had just played Shea Stadium. The Vietnam War was getting bigger, and in New York City, the 5 families of the Italian-American Mafia were at the height of their power. It was into this world that Karen Friedman, a young Jewish woman from Long Island, would step. Though she had no idea what waited for her. Karen Friedman wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't one of those girls who thought gangsters were romantic or looked for a dangerous life. She was an ordinary young woman from a good family raised with traditional values. The kind of girl who was expected to marry a doctor or a lawyer, settle down in the suburbs, and raise children in safety and comfort. Her parents had worked hard to give her a normal, secure life, the American dream that so many immigrants and their children had chased since coming to this country. But fate, or maybe destiny, had other plans for Karen Friedman. The meeting happened because of Paul Vario, a caporegime captain in the Lucchese crime family, one of New York's 5 mafia families. Vario was a powerful man, the kind who ran his neighborhood in East New York, Brooklyn, like a king. He owned a pizzeria called Villa Capra that was used as a cover for his operations, and he was both loved and feared equally by those who knew him. When Vario wanted something done, it got done. When he suggested something, it wasn't really a suggestion at all. Paul Vario had a son who needed a date, and he had insisted that one of his young helpers, a charming Irish-Italian kid named Henry Hill, go with his son on a double date. Henry Hill was 22 years old in 1965, and he'd already been involved with the mob for a decade, since he was just 12 years old. He'd grown up in the shadow of the Lucchese family's cab stand in Brooklyn, fascinated by the wise guys who seemed to have all the money, all the respect, and all the freedom that regular working people could never dream of. For Henry, being a gangster wasn't just a job choice. It was a calling, a religion, a way of life that made sense in a way that regular society never could. He'd made his first big steal at 13, stolen his first car at 15, and by the time he was in his early 20s, he was a trusted helper of the Lucchese family, doing truck hijackings at JFK Airport and making more money than his father had ever seen in his whole life as a construction worker. The double date took place at Frankie the Wop, Manzo's restaurant, Villa Capra, Paul Vario's own place. Karen arrived with her friend, nervous but curious. She'd been told she'd be meeting someone connected to Paul Vario, but she didn't fully understand what that meant in her world. She knew a little about organized crime. You couldn't grow up in New York without hearing whispers about the mob, but it existed in newspaper headlines and movie theaters, not in her real life. From the moment Karen sat down across from Henry Hill, she could tell this wasn't going to be a normal date. The evening was, by all accounts, a disaster. Henry wasn't at his most charming best that night. Maybe he was angry about being forced into the date by Paul Vario, or maybe he simply wasn't interested. Whatever the reason, the chemistry wasn't there. The conversation was awkward. And when the night ended, Karen went home thinking she'd never see Henry Hill again. She was relieved, actually. There was something about him, something dangerous hiding beneath the surface. It both attracted her and scared her away. It was a warning sign that she would later wish she had paid attention to. But Henry Hill was not a man who liked to fail, especially when it came to women. Whether it was hurt pride or real interest that grew after the fact, he decided he wanted to see Karen again. They made another date, this time just the two of them. Karen agreed, giving him a second chance. And then Henry stood her up. He didn't call, didn't show up, didn't send word. Karen waited, feeling silly and angry. Any normal woman would have given up on him entirely at that point. 2 strikes and you're out. That's the rule. She should have forgotten about Henry Hill, should have moved on with her life, should have dated the nice Jewish boys her parents approved of. But Henry wasn't done with her yet. When he finally did reach out again, smooth and sorry, using the great charm that had gotten him out of trouble so many times before, Karen made a decision that would change the whole course of her life. She agreed to see him again. This time, Henry was ready to impress. Their next date was at the Copacabana, the famous Manhattan nightclub that was the center of New York's nightlife. In the 1960s, the Copa was where celebrities mixed with mobsters, where Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. performed, where being seen was almost as important as seeing the show. Getting a table at the Copa on a weekend night was nearly impossible for ordinary people. You needed connections. You needed to know somebody. You needed to slip the maitre d' a big bribe. Henry Hill didn't wait in line. What happened that night would become one of the most famous scenes in Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, shown in a single tracking shot that followed Henry and Kareem through the back entrance of the Copa, through the kitchen, past the cooks and waiters, into the main room where a table that hadn't been there moments before was set up for them, right in front of the stage. For Karen, it was like entering a different world, a magical place where normal rules didn't apply. Everyone seemed to know Henry. Everyone wanted to say hello, to shake his hand, to be seen with him. Drinks appeared at their table, drinks they hadn't ordered, drinks they didn't have to pay for, sent over by people who wanted Henry's goodwill. The staff treated them like royalty. The show was amazing. But Karen found herself watching Henry as much as the entertainment, trying to understand who this young man really was. "What do you do?" she asked at some point during the evening, the question that everyone asks on dates. Henry's answer was vague, on purpose. He was in construction. He did business with Paul Vario. He was an entrepreneur. The details were fuzzy, but the results were clear. Henry had money, lots of it, and he wasn't shy about spending it. For Karen, who had never experienced anything like this, it was exciting. The glamour, the excitement, the sense of being special, of being with someone who could make things happen with a snap of his fingers. It was tempting in a way she'd never imagined. The nice boys she dated before, the ones with steady jobs and sensible plans for the future, suddenly seemed boring by comparison. Henry began courting her seriously. And when Henry Hill wanted to win someone over, he was very good at it. There were more dates at the Copa, at other exclusive clubs, where Henry never waited in line and never paid full price. There were dinners at the best Italian restaurants in New York, where the owners would come out to greet Henry personally and send over free appetizers and desserts. There were gifts, expensive perfume, jewelry, flowers delivered to her door. And there was respect, a special kind of respect that Karen had never experienced before. When she was with Henry, people treated her differently. Doors opened, tables appeared, problems disappeared. It was a thrilling feeling being part of that world, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. Her parents were worried. They could tell something was different about this Henry Hill character. He didn't have a regular job, didn't talk about college or career plans, seemed to have too much money for someone his age. They asked questions that Karen couldn't fully answer because she didn't know the answers herself. Or maybe she knew and didn't want to admit it. The truth was getting harder to avoid. Karen was smart enough to read between the lines, to understand that Henry's business wasn't completely legal. that his connection to Paul Vario meant something more than a simple boss-worker relationship. She'd grown up in New York. She knew what it meant to be connected, to be part of that life. But by then, she was already falling in love. Henry had a quality that would be both his greatest gift and his final downfall. He was charming, really charming, with a smile that could light up a room and a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world when he paid attention to you. He was funny, quick-witted, generous with his money and his time. He wasn't some tough guy stereotype from the movies. He was smart, well-dressed, cultured in his own way, and he was exciting. Corinne's life before Henry had been predictable, safe, maybe even a little boring. Henry offered adventure, unpredictability, a life that was anything but ordinary for a young woman in her early 20s. That kind of excitement was hard to resist, even when warning bells were ringing in the background. The courtship continued through 1965, with Henry doing everything he could. They went to the racetrack where Henry seemed to know everyone and placed bets with easy confidence. They went to boxing matches, where they sat in good seats and Henry pointed out who was who in the crowd. Made men, associates, the kind of people whose names sometimes appeared in newspaper headlines about organized crime. They went to parties where the liquor flowed freely and the women wore furs even in summer, and everyone seemed to have more cash than they knew what to do with. Corinne began to meet Henry's world. There was Paul Vario, of course, the man who had accidentally brought them together. Paul was in his 40s by then, a heavy, balding man with a quiet voice and an air of total authority. When Paul spoke, people listened. When Paul wanted something, it appeared. Corinne learned quickly that Paul Vario was not just Henry's boss. He was his teacher, his protector, almost a father figure. Henry looked up to Paul in a way that he'd never looked up to his own father. There was Jimmy Burke, known as Jimmy the Gent because of his habit of giving expensive gifts to his friends and helpers. Jimmy was Irish, like Henry's father, and he was charming in his own way, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Jimmy was a great hijacker, a man who could steal anything and sell it quickly for the most money. He treated Henry like a younger brother, teaching him the finer points of theft and trickery. And there was Tommy DeSimone, an unstable, dangerous young man with a quick temper and a reputation for violence. Tommy was the kind of guy who would make you laugh one minute and shoot you the next if you said the wrong thing. Henry and Tommy had grown up together in the life, and there was a bond between them. But Corinne could sense that Tommy was trouble, serious trouble. These were Henry's people, his family, in a way that was stronger than blood relations. This was the world she was entering, though she still didn't fully understand what that meant. As the relationship grew, Henry began to tell her more about his life, though he was always careful, always mindful of what he said and how he said it. He told her about growing up in Brooklyn, the son of an Irish-American father and an Italian-American mother, never quite fitting in with either side of the family. He told her about discovering the cab stand across the street from his childhood home, watching the wise guys come and go with their sharp suits and their rolls of cash, deciding at 12 years old that he wanted that life more than anything. He told her about his first arrest at 16, how his father had beaten him for bringing shame to the family, how he'd gone right back to the streets as soon as the police stopped watching. He told her about learning the business from the ground up, how to hijack trucks, how to sell stolen goods, how to keep his mouth shut when questioned by the police, how to earn and keep respect in a world where respect was like money. What he didn't tell her, not yet, was about the violence, the beatings, the occasional murder. He didn't tell her about the men who disappeared, about the bodies that were never found, about the code of silence that could get you killed if you broke it. Those truths would come later, slowly, as she was pulled deeper into the life. Corinne, for her part, was dazzling. She was beautiful, dark hair, striking features, a figure that turned heads. But she was more than just beautiful. She was smart, perceptive, with a sharp wit that could match Henry's. She wasn't some mob groupie looking for thrills. She was a young woman of substance who brought something to the relationship. Beyond just her looks, Henry's friends approved. Even Paul Vario, who was famously picky about the women his helpers dated, seemed to like Karen. She was classy, well-mannered, knew how to act in social situations. She understood without being told some of the unspoken rules of their world. You didn't ask too many questions. You didn't gossip. You kept family business private. By late 1965, Henry and Karen were deeply involved. They spent almost every night together, with Henry showering her with gifts and attention. He rented an apartment in Queens, a nice place that was under a fake name. And Karen began spending time there, slowly moving her things in. Creating a space that was theirs together, her parents were more and more alarmed. Their daughter was involved with this young man who had no visible way of supporting himself, who kept strange hours, who seemed to be mixed up with some very questionable people. They tried to talk to her, tried to warn her, tried to forbid her from seeing him. But Karen was in love. And when you're in love at 22 years old, you don't listen to reason. You don't believe that anything bad can happen. You're invincible, untouchable, blessed. All the warnings sound like the worried complaints of people who don't understand, who've never felt what you feel, who have never experienced the kind of passion and excitement that makes ordinary life seem dull by comparison. As 1965 turned into 1966, Henry proposed. It wasn't a surprise. They talked about marriage, about building a life together, about having children someday. Karen said yes without hesitation. She loved him, and she believed, truly believed, that love would be enough, that she could handle whatever challenges came with being Henry Hill's wife. The wedding was planned for a spring day in North Carolina, away from the watching eyes of New York law enforcement and the complicated family dynamics back home. Henry's mob friends couldn't exactly show up as themselves at a traditional Long Island wedding without drawing unwanted attention. But Karen's parents refused to go. They begged her to rethink, to think about what kind of life she was choosing, to understand that once she married Henry Hill, there would be no going back. The bridge would be burned. Karen went ahead anyway. Love, she thought, was more important than her parents' approval. She was young, hopeful, convinced that she could handle anything as long as she and Henry were together. The wedding day arrived in the spring of 1966. Even though it was in North Carolina, it was a big event. Henry's friends from the life showed up in Force Wise guys in expensive suits, their wives covered in jewelry, everyone celebrating as if this were a royal wedding. Paul Vario was there, giving his blessing like a mob godfather. Jimmy Burke was there, along with his wife Mickey. Tommy DeSimone was there, already drunk and loud by midday. For Karen, it should have been the happiest day of her life. And in many ways it was. She looked beautiful in her wedding dress. Henry looked handsome in his tuxedo, and they were surrounded by people who seemed genuinely happy for them. The food was plentiful, the liquor flowed freely, the music was loud and joyful, but there was an undercurrent of something else. A sense that this wedding wasn't just about two young people in love. It was about Karen being formally brought into a world that had its own rules, its own codes, its own harsh justice. She was now a mob wife, even if Henry was technically just an associate and not a made man. Himself, his Irish background prevented him from being formally brought into the Italian-dominated Mafia. As the reception went on, a night grew later. Karen watched the men huddle in corners, talking business, making plans, their voices low and serious, even as their wives danced and laughed. She watched the way they treated each other, the respect, the careful order that governed every interaction. She watched the way they treated their women, with a mix of protectiveness and possessiveness that was both flattering and a little scary. And she realized, perhaps for the first time, that she'd made a choice that couldn't be undone. She was Mrs. Henry Hill now, for better or worse. And all the romantic ideas she'd had about changing him or pulling him away from the life were just fantasies. Henry Hill was a gangster, and he would always be a gangster. That was his identity, his purpose, his reason for existing. The question was whether Karen could live with that reality. Whether she was strong enough, tough enough, to survive in a world where the rules were different, where danger lurked beneath the surface of every social interaction, where one wrong word or one moment of carelessness could mean the difference between life and death. That, as Henry carried her over the threshold of their hotel room that night, Karen made a silent promise to herself. She would be strong. She would adapt. She would learn the rules of this new world and follow them. She would be the perfect mob wife, loyal, quiet, supportive, tough when necessary. She had no idea how hard it would be to keep that promise, or what it would finally cost her. But for now, on her wedding night in 1966, with her husband's arms around her and the future stretching out before them like an unexplored country, Karen Hill allowed herself to believe in the fairy tale just a little bit longer. The honeymoon period, both real and symbolic, wouldn't last forever. But for these brief shining moments, everything seemed possible. Love seemed enough. The dream seemed real. Little did Karen know that she had just married into a nightmare that would take 25 years to wake up from. The first few years of marriage, too, Henry Hill were, strangely, some of the best times of Karen's life. She was young in love, and living in a way that seemed impossibly glamorous to the suburban girl she'd been just a few years earlier. The mob life, as she experienced it in the late 1960s and early 1970s, wasn't the violent, terrifying existence shown in movies. It was dinners at the best restaurants, shopping trips where price tags didn't matter, parties that lasted until dawn, and a sense of community among the mob wives that was both warm and incredibly strict in its rules. Henry was making money, lots of it. The truck hijackings at JFK Airport were very profitable during this time. JFK was a major international airport, which meant that the cargo coming through was often extremely valuable. Designer clothing, electronics, jewelry, liquor, cigarettes, food, anything that could be stolen and sold. Henry and his crew would get tips from inside men working at the airport, find out which trucks were carrying the most valuable loads, and then hijack them with a mix of threats and efficiency. The beauty of the operation was its simplicity. The truck drivers rarely fought back. They were usually in on it or understood that fighting would only get them hurt. The cargo was quickly moved to safe places, then sold through Jimmy Burke's wide network of buyers. The profit was huge, and the risk of getting caught was relatively low as long as you didn't get greedy or careless. Henry's cut from these jobs meant that cash flowed into the Hill household in a steady stream. And not just cash gifts, too. When you steal truckloads of designer goods, you don't sell everything. You keep some of the best items for yourself, your wife, your friends. Karen found herself with a wardrobe that would have been the envy of any fashion magazine editor. Designer dresses, expensive coats, shoes that cost more than some people's monthly rent. But it wasn't just about the material things, though those were certainly nice. It was about the lifestyle, the sense of being special, of being above the ordinary worries that bothered regular people. Henry and Corinne didn't worry about mortgage payments or grocery bills or saving for retirement. Money came in, money went out. There was always more where that came from. They lived well, but not too showy. That was one of the rules Henry had learned from Paul Vario. Don't attract attention. Don't buy a mansion when a nice house will do. Don't drive a Rolls-Royce when a Cadillac will serve the same purpose. Don't flash your wealth in ways that will bring the IRS or the FBI to your door. Live comfortably, but not suspiciously. So they had a nice house in a nice neighborhood, not the fanciest house on the block, but nice enough. They had good cars, Cadillacs, usually, or Lincolns, but not a whole fleet of them. Karen dressed well. but she wasn't dripping with jewelry every time she left the house. They took vacations to Florida and Las Vegas, but they weren't flying off to Europe constantly. The key was to appear successful, but not strangely wealthy. Henry told people he was in construction or that he had various business interests. The neighbors knew better than to ask too many questions. In certain New York neighborhoods in the 1970s, there were a lot of men who were in business or in construction, and everyone understood what that really meant. It was just something you didn't talk about directly. Karen adapted to her new life with surprising ease. She had a natural instinct for the social politics of the mob world, understanding without being told what could be said and what couldn't, what questions could be asked and which topics were off limits. She learned the order of importance, who was made, who was just an associate, who was moving up, who was falling out of favor. She learned to read the small signs that showed when business was good or when there was trouble coming. Most importantly, she learned the role of a mob wife. It was a specific role with specific expectations, and breaking those expectations could have serious consequences, not just social consequences, but potentially dangerous ones. The first rule was loyalty above all else. A mob wife was expected to be absolutely loyal to her husband and, by extension, to his helpers and their families. You didn't gossip about your husband's business. You didn't complain to outsiders about your marriage. You didn't make friends with people outside the life who might ask uncomfortable questions. Your loyalty was total and unquestioned. The second rule was silence. You didn't talk about what you knew, and you tried not to know too much in the first place. When the men went into another room to talk business, you didn't listen in. When your husband came home with blood on his shirt, you didn't ask whose blood it was. When money appeared, you didn't ask where it came from. The code of silence, omerta, wasn't just for the men. The wives were expected to live by it too. The third rule was appearance. You were expected to look good always. Your appearance reflected on your husband and, by extension, on his standing in the organization. The mob wives Corinne knew spent hours on their hair, their makeup, their clothes. They went to the salon every week. They dressed like they were always ready for a party, because in a way they were. You never knew when your husband would call and say he was bringing people over or that there was a dinner you needed to go to, or a wedding or a funeral or some other social event. The fourth rule was looking the other way. You didn't ask about your husband's girlfriends. You knew they existed, all the men had them, or most of them anyway. It was just part of the life. The wives were expected to ignore it, to pretend they didn't know, to keep up the appearance of the happy marriage even when everyone knew the truth. As long as the husband was discreet and didn't embarrass his wife publicly, it was tolerated. The fifth rule was competence. When your husband got arrested, you were expected to know what to do. You called the lawyer, you arranged bail. You made sure messages got passed. You took care of business on the outside while he was inside. When the FBI came knocking, you were expected to say nothing, give them nothing, and get them away from your door as quickly as possible. You were part of the system that kept the organization running. Corinne learned all these rules, and she learned them well. She became friends with the other mob wives, particularly Mickey Burke, Jimmy's wife, and Rosie Vario, Paul's wife. These women became her social circle, her support system, her teachers in the ways of mob life. The wives formed their own tight community. They shopped together, went to lunch together, went to each other's family events. They shared recipes and child-rearing advice. They complained about their husbands in a carefully worded way that acknowledged reality without ever saying it directly. They supported each other through the arrests, the trials, the jail time, the affairs, all the challenges that came with being married to men in the life. There was real friendship there, but there was also watching. The wives watched each other, making sure no one was breaking the rules, making sure no one was weak, making sure no one was cooperating with law enforcement. Trust within the community was essential. but it was also carefully checked. One wife turning informant could bring down an entire organization. In 1967, Karen gave birth to her first child, a daughter they named Judy. Becoming a mother changed Karen in deep ways. Suddenly, the glamorous life she'd been living wasn't just about her anymore. She had a child to protect, a child who would grow up in this world, a child who would be shaped by the same forces that were shaping Karen herself. She threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she'd brought to being a mob wife. She would be a good mother, maybe even a great one. She would give her daughter all the material advantages that money could buy. She would protect her from the darker realities of her father's business for as long as possible. She would create a stable, loving home environment, even though stability and mob life were fundamentally at odds. Henry, for his part, was a loving father when he was around. He loved his daughter, played with her, bought her expensive toys and clothes. But he was often absent, sometimes for days at a time, off doing jobs or hiding from the police, or just spending time with his girlfriends and his friends from the life. Karen learned to manage the household alone, to be both mother and father when necessary, to keep up the appearance of normalcy for her daughter's sake. In 1970, their second child was born, another daughter named Ruth. Now Karen had 2 children to raise in this impossible world. 2 daughters who would grow up with a father who was charming and generous and completely without morals, who would never have a normal childhood, who would carry the weight of their family secrets for the rest of their lives. Karen loved her daughters fiercely, protectively, with a desperation that came from understanding how shaky their situation really was. She tried to give them structure, routine, stability, all the things that were missing from her marriage to Henry. She made sure they went to good schools, had nice clothes, took music lessons, did all the normal things that normal children did. But there was nothing normal about their life. And as the girls grew older, they began to understand that their father wasn't like other fathers, that their family wasn't like other families, that there were secrets they weren't supposed to talk about and questions they weren't supposed to ask. The 1970s rolled on and the good times continued. But there were cracks appearing in the surface. Henry's arrests were becoming more frequent. He'd been arrested many times since Karen had known him, but they'd always managed to get him out on bail, and he'd either beaten the charges or gotten off with light sentences. But the FBI was paying more attention now, building bigger cases, looking for ways to turn helpers into informants. Paul Vario was arrested on various charges. Jimmy Burke was in and out of prison. Other members of the crew were getting locked up or killed. The Lucchese family was under intense pressure from law enforcement. And the glory days of the 1960s, when the mob seemed untouchable, were fading into memory. Henry started using cocaine. At first, it was just for fun, something he did at parties or after a big score. But cocaine was different from the other drugs Henry had tried over the years. Cocaine was tempting, sneaky, addictive in a way that liquor or marijuana weren't. And Henry, who had an addictive personality anyway, fell hard for the white powder. Karen watched with growing alarm as Henry's cocaine use grew. He went from using sometimes to using regularly to using constantly. He was snorting lines in the morning to wake up, snorting lines in the afternoon to stay sharp, snorting lines at night to keep partying. His behavior became more erratic, more paranoid, more unpredictable. And it wasn't just using anymore. Henry started dealing cocaine too. It was too profitable to ignore. The profit on cocaine made truck hijacking look like small-time stuff. You could buy a kilo for a few thousand and sell it for many times that amount. It was pure profit. And in the mid to late 1970s, the cocaine trade was exploding in New York. But dealing cocaine broke one of the main rules of the old-school mob. The bosses, the made men, the ones who ran the families, had traditionally stayed away from drug trafficking. There was too much heat from law enforcement, too many years in prison if you got caught. Too much risk of helpers becoming informants to avoid long sentences. The bosses put up with some drug dealing by the lower level guys, but they didn't like it, and they certainly didn't want to be involved themselves. Henry was bringing unnecessary heat onto the crew. Paul Vario wasn't happy about it. Jimmy Burke wasn't happy about it. But Henry couldn't stop himself. The money was too good, and the cocaine had its hooks in him too deep. Karen found herself pulled into the drug business despite her better judgment. When Henry got arrested and needed bail money, she sold cocaine to raise the cash. When Henry was hiding out and needed money delivered to him, she drove to his location with drugs or cash wrapped in packages in her purse. When the FBI was watching the house, she helped Henry hide his stash in creative places. She became an accomplice, not just a bystander. And she hated it that the truck hijacking had seemed almost victimless. Insurance companies paid for the losses. Nobody got hurt. It was theft, but it wasn't violence. The cocaine trade was different. She saw what the drug did to people. She saw the violence that surrounded it. She saw how it was destroying her husband, and by extension, her family. There was a famous incident that would later be shown in Goodfellas, the time Karen held a gun to Henry's head while he slept. The affair that caused this moment wasn't his first, and it wouldn't be his last. Henry had always had girlfriends, but usually he was discreet about it, following the unspoken rule that you don't embarrass your wife publicly. But one of his girlfriends lived right across the street from their house, right across the street where Karen could watch him come and go, where the neighbors could see, where her daughters might notice. It was a humiliation, a breaking of the basic respect that was supposed to exist in mob marriages. Karen snapped. She got Henry's gun, and he always had guns around the house. Several of them in various places, and she stood over him while he slept, holding the barrel to his head, her finger on the trigger, imagining what would happen if she just squeezed. The satisfaction, the revenge, the end of all the betrayal and the lies and the fear. But she didn't pull the trigger. Maybe because she still loved him somewhere beneath all the anger. Maybe because she was afraid of what would happen to her daughters if she killed their father. Maybe because she understood that killing a mob helper would bring consequences she couldn't imagine. Maybe because in the end, she was too civilized, too against violence to actually commit murder. She woke him up instead. She screamed at him, threatened him, told him that the girlfriend across the street was over, that he needed to end it immediately or she would end the marriage. Henry, shocked into temporary sobriety by the gun to his head, agreed. He ended the relationship with that particular mistress, though of course there would be others. The incident should have been a wake-up call for both of them. It should have been the moment when they admitted that their marriage was falling apart, that the life was destroying them, that they needed to make changes. But they were too deep in by then, too invested in the lifestyle, too afraid of what life outside the mob would look like. Karen had no job skills, no career, no way to support herself and her daughters outside of Henry's income. Henry had no identity outside of being a gangster. They were trapped by their choices, by their circumstances, by the life they'd built over more than a decade together. And the worst was yet to come. In December 1978, a crew connected to Jimmy Burke pulled off what would become known as the Lufthansa heist, the theft of $6 million in cash and jewelry from a Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport. It was one of the largest cash robberies in American history at the time, and it should have been the score of a lifetime for everyone involved. Henry wasn't directly involved in the heist itself, but he was close to the crew that pulled it off, and he knew all the details. What he also knew, what everyone knew, was that the heist brought an unbelievable amount of law enforcement attention. The FBI threw huge resources into investigating the Lufthansa robbery. They were watching everyone even slightly connected to Jimmy Burke and the Lucchese family. The smart move would have been to lay low, to hide the money, to wait years before spending any of it. But greed and stupidity won out. Some of the guys who'd been involved started spending noticeably, buying Cadillacs, flashing cash, living large. They were breaking the main rule: don't attract attention. Jimmy Burke, who had planned the heist, saw the heat coming and made a cold calculation. The only way to protect himself was to eliminate everyone who could testify against him. One by one, the men who'd been involved in the Lufthansa heist started disappearing or turning up dead. Karen watched from the sidelines as men she'd known for years, men who'd been at her wedding, men whose wives she'd been friends with, vanished. Bodies were found in car trunks, in empty lots, buried in shallow graves. Whole families disappeared overnight. The wives became widows. The children became orphans. And everyone understood why, but no one could say it out loud. This was the reality of mob life that the glamorous dinners and the expensive gifts had hidden from view. This was what happened when you became a liability, when you knew too much, when the bosses decided you were a risk. Loyalty only went one way. The organization would kill you without hesitation if it served their interests. Karen was terrified. Henry knew everything about the Lufthansa heist, even though he hadn't participated directly. He knew who was involved, how they'd done it, where some of the money had gone. If the FBI put enough pressure on Jimmy Burke, would Jimmy decide that Henry was too much of a risk? Would they wake up one night to find Tommy DeSimone at their door, ready to kill Henry and maybe Karen too, just to tie up loose ends? The paranoia that had always existed in the background of mob life became sharp, overwhelming. Karen stopped trusting anyone. She watched every car that drove past their house, wondering if it was FBI surveillance or something worse. She questioned Henry constantly. Who had he talked to? What had he said? Was he being careful? Did he think they were safe? Henry's cocaine addiction, which had already been bad, spiraled completely out of control. He was using constantly, dealing constantly, growing more paranoid and erratic by the day. His behavior became increasingly strange and dangerous. Then Henry went to prison for a short time on drug charges. It was maybe 4 months, not long in the grand scheme of things, but for Karen, those 4 months would change everything in ways she couldn't have predicted. Paul Vario, Henry's teacher and protector for more than 15 years, approached Karen while Henry was locked up. Paul had always been friendly with Karen, always treated her with respect. But now he wanted something different. He made advances, suggested an affair, pressured her in ways that were both subtle and clear. Karen was caught in an impossible situation. Paul Vario was one of the most powerful men in the Lucchese family. You didn't say no to Paul Vario without consequences. Henry's entire career, his very survival, depended on Paul's goodwill and protection. If Karen rejected Paul's advances, would Paul turn against Henry? Would he withdraw his protection, leaving Henry open to the violence that was consuming everyone connected to the Lufthansa heist? But if she agreed to the affair, she would be betraying Henry in the most basic way. And what would happen when Henry got out of prison and found out? Would he blame her? Would he blame Paul? Either way, it could lead to violence, to death. The situation became even more complicated and dangerous when Tommy DeSimone entered the picture. Tommy had always been unstable, violent, scary. But now he was completely out of control, paranoid and violent even by mob standards. He'd been involved in the Lufthansa heist, and he knew that Jimmy Burke was systematically eliminating everyone who could testify. Tommy approached Karen one night, drunk or high or both, and tried to attack her. The details of exactly what happened have never been fully told. Karen has protected her daughter's privacy and her own dignity by not discussing the specifics publicly. But it was serious enough, threatening enough, that it represented a breaking of all the rules that supposedly governed mob life. You didn't touch another man's wife, especially not the wife of someone like Henry Hill. It was a basic breaking of the code. The kind of thing that could get you killed under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Tommy was already marked for death because of his involvement in the Lufthansa heist. He just didn't know it yet. In January 1979, Tommy DeSimone disappeared. He was reportedly called to a meeting where he thought he was going to be formally brought into the Mafia as a full member. Instead, he was murdered, almost certainly by John Gotti and other Gambino family members as payback for an earlier killing Tommy had committed. His body was never found. For Karen, Tommy's disappearance was both a relief and a horror. She was glad he was gone, glad she wouldn't have to fear him anymore. But the casual way he'd been erased from existence, the complete lack of consequences for his killers, the way everyone just moved on as if Tommy had never existed, it was a sharp reminder of how cheap life was in the mob world. Henry got out of prison in early 1980 to find his world falling apart. The Lufthansa investigation was getting stronger. His cocaine business was attracting FBI attention. His relationship with Paul Vario was strained. His marriage to Karen was hanging by a thread, held together only by fear and habit and the shared trauma of 15 years in the life. And then came May 11th, 1980. The day that everything ended. May 11th, 1980 started like many other days in the Hill household, which meant it started badly. Henry was using cocaine before breakfast, paranoid and jittery, convinced that someone was following him. Karen was exhausted, worn down by years of fear and lies and disappointment. The children, now teenagers, were trying to keep some semblance of normal life, despite everything falling apart around them. Henry had continued dealing cocaine, even though he knew the FBI was watching him. He couldn't stop himself. The addiction controlled him now, not the other way around. He was supposed to meet his cocaine connection, a woman who was supplying him with kilos of pure product that he would cut and distribute through his network of dealers. What Henry didn't know was that the FBI had been building a case against him for months. They had surveillance, they had informants, they had phone taps. They knew about his drug operation, knew about his connection, knew his schedule and his patterns. They were just waiting for the right moment to take him down. Karen had tried to warn him. She'd begged him to stop dealing, to lie low, to understand that they were in real danger. But Henry was too far gone, too deep in the cocaine paranoia, too convinced of his own cleverness. He thought he could outsmart the FBI, thought he could keep dealing just a little bit longer, make just a little bit more money, and maybe get out of the life. It was a fantasy, and they both knew it. Nobody got out of the life. Not really. You either died or went to prison or, in very rare cases, became an informant. Those were the only exits. That morning, Henry was convinced he was being followed by a helicopter. Karen thought it was the cocaine paranoia talking. He'd been more and more convinced that the FBI was using helicopters to track his movements, hovering overhead as he drove around doing his business. But this time, he was actually right. The FBI was using aerial surveillance, following him throughout the day as he picked up drugs, delivered packages, met with his helpers. Henry spent May 11th driving all over New York, making drops, collecting money, snorting cocaine to stay alert. Karen was with him for part of the day, terrified, begging him to stop, knowing that something bad was going to happen, but unable to prevent it. They stopped at Karen's mother's house at one point. Henry asked Karen's mother to hide a package, a large amount of cocaine. Karen's mother, who had never approved of Henry, who had warned Karen about him 15 years earlier, was now being asked to become an accomplice to federal drug trafficking. It was a mark of how far the family had fallen, how completely the mob life had corrupted everything it touched. That night, the FBI made their move. They arrested Henry at their home in front of Karen and the children. They also arrested Karen herself, charging her as an accomplice in Henry's drug operation. Both of them were taken into custody, processed, held in separate cells. For Karen, it was a new level of nightmare. She'd been arrested before on minor charges, but this was different. These were serious federal charges, the kind that could send her to prison for years. And what would happen to her daughters? They were just children. Who would take care of them if both their parents went to prison? The reality of her situation crashed down on Karen in that cell. 15 years of living the mob life. 15 years of luxury and excitement and fear. And it had all led to this. Sitting in a jail cell, facing serious prison time. Her children's futures destroyed, her own life in ruins. Henry and Karen both made bail, but the terms were strict. They were facing decades in prison if convicted. The federal drug trafficking charges carried mandatory minimum sentences. They were looking at spending the rest of their lives in prison. Henry faced an additional problem that Karen didn't fully understand at first. He wasn't just facing federal charges. He was also in debt to his mob helpers, particularly Paul Vario. When you're a mob helper, you have to give a percentage of your earnings to your capo. It's part of the system, the tribute that flows up the chain of command. But Henry had been spending all his money on cocaine, and his drug operation had been costing him more than it made. He owed money, a lot of money, and Paul Vario was not a patient lender. Henry had heard the stories about what happened to people who owed money they couldn't pay back. They disappeared. Their bodies turned up in car trunks or not at all. Jimmy Burke had just finished killing everyone connected to the Lufthansa heist. Would Paul Vario decide that Henry was too much of a liability? Too much of a risk? Not worth keeping alive? Henry and Karen had a series of desperate conversations in the days following their arrest. What were their options? They could fight the charges, hire expensive lawyers, try to beat the case. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. The FBI had surveillance, had caught them red-handed with cocaine, had multiple counts they could charge them with. The chances of winning a trial were almost zero. They could plead guilty and hope for leniency. But federal drug trafficking sentences were harsh in 1980. They were looking at 10 years minimum, probably more. Karen would be in prison while her daughters grew up. She'd miss their teenage years, their graduations, their weddings, everything. And what would happen to the girls while their parents were in prison? Or they could do the unthinkable. They could cooperate with the FBI. They could become informants. They could testify against the people who'd been their friends, their community, their family for 15 years. They could violate omerta, break the code of silence, commit the ultimate betrayal. The punishment for informing was death. Not just death for Henry, but possibly death for Karen too. And maybe even their daughters. The mob didn't forgive informants, and they didn't forget. They would hunt Henry down for the rest of his life. And if they couldn't find him, they might go after his family instead. But the alternative was spending decades in prison and possibly getting killed by Paul Vario or Jimmy Burke anyway for being in debt or knowing too much about the Lufthansa heist. Henry met with the FBI. They told him what they wanted. Testimony against Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario, the two men who had been Henry's closest helpers for 20 years. They wanted details about the truck hijackings, about the Lufthansa heist, about murders that had never been solved. They wanted Henry to wear a wire to record conversations, to help them build cases that would put the leadership of the Lucchese family in prison for life. In exchange, they offered the witness protection program. New identities, new location, protection from mob revenge, minimal prison time for Henry's cooperation. It was a package deal. If Henry agreed, Karen and the children would be included. They'd all go into witness protection together, start over somewhere far from New York, live under fake names for the rest of their lives. Karen was brought into the discussions. The FBI explained what witness protection meant. They would have to leave everything behind, their families, their friends, their homes, everything they'd collected over 15 years of marriage. They'd get new names, new social security numbers, new backgrounds. They'd be moved to some unknown city in Middle America. They'd have to cut off all contact with everyone from their previous lives' parents. Siblings, cousins, friends, everyone. If they broke the terms of witness protection, if they contacted anyone from their old lives, if they were caught in any criminal activity, they'd be kicked out of the program and left to fend for themselves. And if the mob found them, the program offered no guarantees. Witness protection reduced the risk, but it didn't eliminate it. Informants had been found and killed before, even under fake names in distant cities. For Karen, it was an impossible choice. Stay silent and go to prison, abandoning her daughters to foster care or relatives who might not want them. Or cooperate and lose everyone she'd ever known except Henry and her children. Become an outcast, a rat's wife, someone who had broken the code. She thought about her mother, who she'd already been estranged from for years, but who she still loved. She thought about what her life would be like in witness protection. No career, no prospects. Tied forever to Henry, who was still a cocaine addict and unfaithful husband. She thought about her daughters growing up under false names, always looking over their shoulders, never able to be honest about who they really were. But mostly she thought about her daughters. If she went to prison, they'd be destroyed. If she stayed out and the mob killed Henry, they might kill her too, leaving the girls orphans. The only way to protect her children was to cooperate, to accept witness protection, to start over in anonymity. Henry had his own calculations. He knew that his former friends were planning to kill him. He'd heard things, seen the patterns. He knew that Paul Vario thought he'd become a liability, that Jimmy Burke didn't trust him anymore. He'd watched too many people disappear after the Lufthansa heist to have any illusions about his own survival chances. And he was facing decades in federal prison for the drug charges. He was 40 years old. By the time he got out, he'd be an old man, his life wasted, his children grown and gone. This way, at least he'd be free. Relatively speaking. He'd be alive. So Henry Hill made the decision that would define the rest of his life and Karen's. He agreed to become an FBI informant. The decision wasn't made in a single moment. There were weeks of negotiations, of meetings with federal prosecutors, of Henry providing information and the FBI checking it. They needed to make sure Henry actually had valuable information, that he could deliver testimony that would lead to convictions. They needed to build their cases carefully. During this period, Henry and Karen lived in a strange limbo. They were out on bail, but effectively under FBI protection. They couldn't go back to their old neighborhood. Word would spread quickly that they were cooperating. They couldn't contact their friends from the mob. They had to stay hidden, moving between safe houses and hotels, waiting for the trials to begin. The children were confused and terrified. They'd been pulled out of their school, away from their friends, told they were going to have new names and move away. They didn't fully understand what was happening, just that everything was ending. That their father had done something unforgivable in the eyes of the community they'd grown up in. Karen tried to shield them as much as possible, tried to make it seem less scary than it was. But how do you tell your teenage daughters that they're going into witness protection because your husband betrayed the mob and now killers might be looking for all of you? How do you explain that they'll never see their grandparents again, never go home again, never be able to use their real names again? The loneliness was deep. Karen couldn't call her mother. She couldn't reach out to the other mob wives who'd been her friends for years. She was cut off from everything familiar, everyone who had defined her life for the past 15 years. She had only Henry and the children. And Henry was still using cocaine and growing more unstable by the day. The FBI interviews were intense. Henry had to recount decades of criminal activity in exact detail. Who was at which meeting? Who said what? Who killed whom? Where were the bodies buried? What did Paul Vario know? What had Jimmy Burke told him? Every conversation, every crime, every secret from 20 years in the mob. All had to be written down, checked, prepared for use in court. Karen was interviewed too. She knew less than Henry about the specific criminal operations, but she knew about the social networks, the relationships, the patterns of mob life. She'd been to hundreds of parties and dinners where things were said, where she'd seen interactions that meant something. All of that became evidence. The waiting was painful. They knew that trials were coming, knew that eventually Henry would have to testify in open court against his former friends. They knew that once he took the stand, there would be no going back, no possibility of making up, no mercy if they were ever found. Karen spent those weeks thinking about the life she was leaving behind. For all its fear and violence and dysfunction, it had been her life. She'd had friends, a community, a role that she understood. She'd been somebody, Mrs. Henry Hill, wife of a respected helper, part of the social fabric of mob life. Now she would be nobody. A woman with a fake name in a fake city with a fake background. She'd have to pretend to be someone she wasn't, lie about her past to anyone who asked. Keep up the fiction of normalcy while carrying the weight of 15 years of secrets. She thought about all the choices that had led to this moment, accepting that first date with Henry, agreeing to marry him despite her parents' objections, looking the other way to his criminal activities, becoming involved in his drug dealing, holding a gun to his head but not pulling the trigger. Each choice had seemed manageable at the time. Just one small compromise, one little adjustment to circumstances. But they'd added up year after year until she was trapped in a situation where every option was terrible. And yet, with all that, she still loved Henry in some complicated, dysfunctional way. He was the father of her children, her companion through all of this, the charming young man she'd fallen for at the Copacabana. The addiction and the violence and the betrayals had damaged that love, twisted it into something unhealthy, but it was still there. A stubborn attachment she couldn't quite break. As the trials approached, Karen tried to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. She would have to sit in the courtroom and watch Henry testify against Paul Vario, the man who'd brought them together, who'd been at their wedding, who'd been a father figure to Henry for 20 years. She'd have to watch him testify against Jimmy Burke, whose wife Mickey had been one of her closest friends. She'd have to see the looks on their faces when they realized the depth of Henry's betrayal. She'd have to endure the hatred, the contempt, the rage directed at both of them. She'd become what mob wives were taught from childhood to hate: a rat's wife, someone who'd broken the code, but she had her daughters to think about. They were innocent in all of this. They deserved a chance at life, even if it was a life built on lies and hidden identities. Karen would do whatever it took to keep them safe, even if it meant becoming someone she'd once despised. The FBI promised them a new start, a clean slate, a chance to build a normal life. Karen wanted desperately to believe them, but she knew better. There were no clean slates. Not really. The past followed you wherever you went. No matter what name you used, Henry would always be Henry, would always be an addict and a criminal, and someone who only thought of himself. She would always be the woman who had chosen him, who'd stayed with him, who'd become involved in his crimes. And somewhere out there in the world they were leaving behind would be people who wanted them dead. That would never change, not for the rest of their lives. They'd always be looking over their shoulders, always wondering if that stranger on the street corner was a contract killer, always knowing that their safety depended on keeping perfect anonymity. As the sun set on their old life and the trials began, Karen Hill prepared herself for the testimony that would change everything. She wasn't just losing her identity. She was losing her entire understanding of who she was. The courtroom was packed the first day Henry Hill took the stand. Karen sat in the gallery, her stomach churning, watching her husband raise his right hand and swear to tell the truth. It was unreal, nightmarish, like watching a movie about someone else's life. In the defendant's chair sat Paul Vario, the man who had set up their first meeting, who had taught Henry since he was a boy, who had protected him for 20 years. Paul's face showed no emotion, but Karen could see the hatred in his eyes when he looked at Henry. This was the ultimate betrayal in Paul's world, worse than theft, worse than murder. Henry was violating omerta, breaking the sacred code of silence that held the mob world together. Henry testified for hours, then days. He detailed decades of criminal activity, the truck hijackings at JFK Airport, the protection rackets, the loan sharking, the gambling operations, the violence. He explained how the Lucchese family operated, the chain of command, the rules, the protocols. He named names, implicated people, provided details that only an insider could know. Karen listened to her husband describe a world she'd been part of but never fully understood. She'd seen the surface, the parties, the money, the social interactions. But Henry was describing what happened in the back rooms, the violence and intimidation and fear that made it all possible. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense lawyers tried to destroy Henry's credibility, pointing out his long criminal record, his cocaine addiction, his lies to law enforcement in the past. They painted him as a desperate man, trying to save his own skin by lying about respected members of the community. They attacked his character, his morals, his reliability as a witness, but the prosecution had supporting evidence, surveillance photos, wiretaps, documents, testimony from other witnesses. Henry wasn't their only source. He was just the most complete one, the insider who could explain what all the other evidence meant. Paul Vario was convicted and sentenced to decades in federal prison. He would die behind bars, an old man brought down by the testimony of someone he had treated like a son. Jimmy Burke went to trial separately and was also convicted, largely on Henry's testimony. He too would die in prison, never again a free man. Wouldn't reach out to any family members from her old life. The rules of witness protection were absolute. No contact with anyone from the past. Breaking that rule would compromise their safety and could get them kicked out of the program. Karen was cut off from everyone who'd known her as herself, everyone who had been part of her life before. May 1980. The loneliness was eating away at her. Karen found herself depressed, withdrawn, going through the motions of daily life without really living. She'd thought witness protection would be a fresh start, a chance to build something better. Instead, it felt like being buried alive, like existing in a shadow life that wasn't quite real. And Henry was unfaithful, again, even in witness protection. Even in this small city where they were supposed to be starting over, Henry found other women. It was a pattern so deeply set that not even the threat of death from mob killers could change it. Karen would find evidence, receipts, phone numbers, lipstick stains, and there would be fights. Accusations, denials, temporary makeups. And then the cycle would start over. She asked herself repeatedly why she stayed. She was in witness protection now. She had FBI protection. She could divorce Henry and strike out on her own. But what would that look like? She had no job skills, no career prospects, no education beyond high school. She'd spent her entire adult life being Henry Hill's wife. She didn't know how to be anything else, and there were the children to consider. As broken as their family was, at least it was a family. If Karen divorced Henry, would the FBI maintain protection for her and the children separately? Would she have to move again? Create another new identity? Uproot her daughters yet again? The practical realities of her situation were stark. She was trapped not by mob violence anymore, but by economic need, by fear of the unknown, by the accumulated weight of 15 years of choices that had left her unprepared for independence. Years passed in this strange limbo. The FBI would periodically move them to new cities when there were security concerns or when Henry's behavior attracted too much attention. Each move meant starting over again, new names sometimes, new schools for the children, new jobs for Henry that he'd inevitably lose, new lives to learn and keep up. Karen lost track of how many times they moved. how many identities she assumed. Each one felt a little less real, a little more like playing a role in a play that would never end. She was a different character in each location, with different biographical details and a different relationship to her supposed past. The only constant was Henry and the children, and even they were changing, being shaped by the constant upheaval and deception. The children grew older, became young adults. They managed to graduate from high school despite all the disruptions, though the achievement felt empty given how much they'd sacrificed. They'd grown up in witness protection, never able to be fully honest with anyone outside their immediate family, always carrying the weight of their father's crimes and their family secrets. Karen watched her daughter struggle with identity issues, relationship problems, the psychological damage of growing up in witness protection. They'd never had a chance at normal lives. They'd been children when this started, innocent victims of their father's choices and their mother's decision to stay with him. Now they were adults, marked forever by those years of hiding and lying in constant fear. And through it all, Karen kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. The mob had long memories. The fact that Henry had testified against Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke would never be forgotten or forgiven. Even though both men were in prison, even though years had passed, Karen knew there were people in the mob who'd want revenge. One day someone might find them. One day the protection might fail. She lived with constant low-level anxiety, always watching for threats, always wondering if that stranger in the grocery store was an assassin, always planning escape routes in her mind. It was no way to live, but it was the life she had. The life she'd chosen when she decided to go into witness protection with Henry Dott by the late 1980s. Karen had been living this way for almost a decade. A decade of false names, false identities, false lives. A decade of loneliness from everyone she'd ever known. A decade of watching Henry fail at legal work and sink deeper into addiction. A decade of trying to be strong for her daughters, all while crumbling inside. Something had to change. Karen couldn't keep living like this. The marriage had been dead for years, held together only by fear and habit and the shared experience of witness protection. Whatever love she'd felt for Henry had been worn away by years of betrayal, addiction, and dysfunction. Around 1989, after approximately 25 years of marriage, from their wedding in 1966, through all the mob years and into witness protection, Karen and Henry separated. It wasn't a dramatic breakup with a specific incident that caused it. It was more like a gradual realization that they couldn't continue the act anymore. That staying together was doing more harm than good. That they'd both be better off apart. The separation was complicated by witness protection. They had to coordinate with their FBI handlers, establish separate living arrangements while keeping security rules, figure out how to divide their lives when those lives were built on shared false identities. It was messy and painful and complicated in ways that normal divorces aren't. Karen filed for divorce in 1990, though the legal proceedings would drag on for years. Divorcing someone in witness protection presented unique challenges. How do you file paperwork under false names? How do you establish the real identities for legal purposes while keeping the fake ones for safety? How do you prove the length of the marriage when all the documentation is secret? The divorce wouldn't be finalized until 2002, 12 years after Karen filed. The delays were partly bureaucratic, partly because Henry argued various aspects of the settlement, partly because the unique circumstances of their situation made everything more complicated than a typical divorce. But even after the separation and the divorce filing, Karen's life remained tied to Henry's in one critical way: witness protection. Her safety still depended on Henry keeping the terms of his agreement, not exposing their location, not drawing attention from mob helpers who might still be looking for revenge. If Henry messed up, Karen and her daughters could pay the price. The 1990s were a period of trying to build some kind of independent life, while still living under the limits of witness protection. Karen was in her 40s now, a single mother even before the divorce was finalized, trying to support herself and finish, raising her daughters in a witness protection program that was never designed for long-term family situations. FBI had originally thought of witness protection as something temporary. You testify, you move, you start over, and eventually you build a legitimate new life. But the reality was far messier. Karen had been in the program for a decade and would remain in it forever. This wasn't temporary protection. It was permanent exile. Finding work was difficult. Karen had no recent work history to put on applications, no references she could provide, no explanation for the gap in her resume that didn't raise red flags. She'd been a housewife in the mob world, which wasn't a career path that translated to mainstream employment. And she couldn't be honest about her past, couldn't explain that she'd spent 15 years as a mob wife and the last decade in witness protection. She took whatever job she could find, retail, restaurant work, office temp positions, anything that didn't require extensive background checks or explanations about her past. The work was low-paying, exhausting, nothing like the life of luxury she'd known in the mob years. She went from shopping without looking at price tags to counting pennies, from wearing designer clothes to buying secondhand, from being treated like royalty to being invisible. But there was something freeing about it too. For the first time in her adult life, Karen was supporting herself. The money she earned was hers, earned legally, not stolen or produced by drug deals or truck hijackings. She wasn't dependent on Henry anymore, wasn't waiting for him to bring home cash from whatever illegal scheme he was running. She was standing on her own 2 feet, however unsteadily. Her daughters were struggling with their own transitions to adulthood. Growing up in witness protection had left them with deep psychological scars. They had identity issues, not knowing quite who they were, having lived under multiple names and false histories. They had trust issues, having been taught from a young age to lie about themselves, to never be fully honest with anyone outside the immediate family. They had relationship problems. How do you build close relationships when you can't be truthful about your past? Karen watched her daughters wrestle with these challenges and carried an enormous burden of guilt. She'd made choices to marry Henry, to stay with him, to go into witness protection that had deeply damaged her children's lives. They'd never asked to be part of the mob world or witness protection. They'd been innocent casualties of their parents' decisions. But despite everything, the girls survived. They finished their educations, started careers, built lives of their own. They carried their family secrets with them, would carry them forever. But they managed to create something resembling normal adult lives. Karen was proud of them in a way that was mixed with sadness for what they'd endured. Meanwhile, Henry was spiraling further out of control. For Karen, watching these trials was devastating. These were men she'd known for years, men whose wives had been her friends, men who'd been at family gatherings and celebrations. Now they were being sent away forever because of what Henry had told the FBI. The mob wives who'd once been Karen's friends now saw her as a traitor by association. She was the rat's wife, involved in Henry's betrayal. Mickey Burke, who had been one of Karen's closest friends for years, looked at her with pure hatred during Jimmy's trial. The community that had supported Karen through the difficult times had turned against her completely, but the trials were just the beginning. Once Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke were convicted, the full reality of witness protection became clear. The FBI had kept their end of the bargain. Henry received a relatively light sentence for his drug trafficking conviction because of his cooperation. But now it was time to leave, to start over, to become different people. The transition into the witness protection program happened quickly. One day they were Henry and Karen Hill, residents of New York with a known history and identity. The next day, they were given new names that felt wrong in their mouths. Names that belonged to other people, imaginary people created by FBI workers. Karen can't reveal what those names were. Even now, decades later, the identities they assumed in witness protection are still secret, still protected. Because witness protection doesn't end just because years have passed. Once you're in the program, you're in it for life. They were moved to a small city in the Midwest. Karen has never said exactly where, and she never will. It was the kind of place that people from New York would dismiss as flyover country, a place where nothing ever happened, where life moved slowly and predictably, where the most exciting event of the week might be a high school football game for Karen, who'd spent 15 years in the heart of New York's mob world. Surrounded by intensity and drama and constant stimulation, it was like being sent to another planet. Everything was different. The pace of life, the way people talked, the social dynamics, the culture. And she couldn't be honest about any of it, because she couldn't reveal where she was from or who she really was. The FBI provided them with a modest house, a basic setup to get started, and some limited financial support. But they were expected to build new lives relatively quickly. Henry was supposed to get a legal job, something conventional. Karen was supposed to become a normal middle American housewife, raising her children in this unknown small city. The children struggled enormously with the change. They'd been pulled out of their schools in New York right before they were supposed to graduate, away from friends they'd known their whole lives, and dropped into a completely different environment where everyone seemed to talk and dress and act differently. They had to learn to respond to their new names, to make up stories about where they were from and why they'd moved, to be constantly careful about what they said and to whom. Teenagers are supposed to be figuring out who they are. But Henry and Karen's daughters had to pretend to be people they weren't. They couldn't talk about their real past, couldn't share family stories, couldn't be honest about their father's criminal history or why they'd moved. Every friendship was built on a foundation of lies. Karen watched her children suffer and felt powerless to help them. She'd made the choice to go into witness protection to protect them, but in doing so, she'd taken away their identities, their communities, their chance at normal adolescence. The guilt was overwhelming. And Henry was falling apart. Away from the mob world that had defined him since he was 12 years old, he didn't know who he was. He tried to hold legal jobs, but he had no real work skills beyond crime. He'd spent his entire adult life stealing and dealing drugs and manipulating people. Asking him to become a regular citizen was like asking a shark to live on land. He lasted a few weeks at various jobs before quitting or getting fired. He couldn't handle taking orders from bosses he didn't respect. He couldn't handle the low pay compared to what he'd made in the mob. He couldn't handle the boredom and sameness of legal work, and he was still using cocaine. The FBI had required him to get clean as part of witness protection, but addiction doesn't just disappear because you move to a new city. Henry was sneaky about it, hiding his drug use from his FBI handlers. But Karen knew. She'd lived with his addiction for years. She could read the signs. The drinking got worse too. Henry had always been a drinker. All the wise guys drank. It was part of the culture. But now he was drinking heavily every day, trying to fill the empty space left by the life he lost. He'd gone from being a respected mob helper with money and status and purpose, to being nobody in a small city where nobody knew his name. The psychological adjustment was more than he could handle. Karen tried to hold the family together, tried to keep some sense of normalcy for her daughters. She enrolled them in local schools, helped them make new friends, went to parent-teacher conferences under her false name. She tried to build a life that looked normal from the outside, even though it was hollow at the center. But it was exhausting, keeping up the lies every day. Every conversation with neighbors or teachers or other parents required careful watching. What could she say? What had to be avoided? What if someone asked a question that would expose the fiction? The mental burden of constantly being on guard, constantly keeping up a false identity, was crushing, and she was lonely, deeply, profoundly lonely. In New York, She'd had a community of mob wives who understood her life, who shared her experiences, who provided support and friendship. Here, she couldn't make real friends because she couldn't be real with anyone. Every relationship was surface level, built on the fake identity the FBI had created for her. She couldn't call her mother, couldn't. He was arrested again in 2005 for drug possession. He appeared on various TV shows and in documentaries. He published a cookbook called The Wise Guy Cookbook. He seemed unable to stop trading on his criminal past, unable to find any other identity or purpose beyond being a former mobster who turned informant. For Corinne, watching from a distance, maintaining no contact with Henry, but hearing about his activities through news reports and their adult daughters, she felt a mixture of pity and scorn. Pity for a man so lost that he had to constantly relive his past. Scorn for someone who seemed to have learned nothing from the destruction his choices had caused, but mostly she felt relief that she was no longer tied to him beyond their shared history. She'd built a separate life, however limited by witness protection. She was her own person now, not just Henry Hill's wife. It had taken decades to achieve that independence, but she had it in 2012. Henry Hill died at age 69 from complications related to heart disease. He'd had a long history of health problems, his body damaged by decades of cocaine use, alcohol abuse, and the general stress of the life he'd lived. He died in a Los Angeles hospital, and his death made news because of his fame from Goodfellas. Corinne learned about his death through the news. Like everyone else, she hadn't spoken to Henry in years, hadn't seen him in even longer. They'd shared 25 years of marriage and produced 2 children together. But by the end, they were strangers connected only by history. She had complicated feelings about his death. There was relief Henry's reckless behavior had always been a threat to her safety, and now that threat was gone. There was sadness despite everything. He'd been a huge part of her life, a father of her children, someone she'd once loved deeply. There was anger. He died without ever truly admitting the damage he'd done, without taking real responsibility for the choices that had destroyed so many lives. The daughters grieved in their own ways, mourning the complicated, flawed man who'd been their father. Corinne supported them through it, knowing that their feelings about Henry were as complex as her own. He'd been charming and generous and fun, but also deeply selfish, addicted, violent, reckless. You could love someone and still acknowledge all the harm they caused. Both things could be true at the same time. After Henry's death, Corinne continued her life in witness protection. She was in her late 60s by then, facing the prospect of growing old under a false identity, carrying secrets that she could never fully share. The younger generations of mob families might not even remember who Henry Hill was or care about revenge anymore. But the rules of witness protection didn't end just because time had passed. She would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, always alert to potential threats. Never fully able to relax into anonymity. It was the price she'd paid for survival, for protecting her daughters, for the choices she'd made in 1965 when she agreed to that first date with Henry Hill. Decades after entering witness protection, Karen Hill, or whatever name she goes by, now lives somewhere in America under an identity that remains secret. She's an elderly woman, a grandmother, someone who looks like any other retired person you might see at the grocery store or in a doctor's waiting room. Nothing about her appearance would suggest the extraordinary life she's lived. She's given very few interviews over the years, always careful about what she reveals, always protective of her privacy and security. The details of her current life, where she lives, what name she uses, what she does with her time, remain secret. She's learned the hard way that survival depends on anonymity, that the past can reach forward across decades to destroy you if you're not careful. The myth of mob life, the glamorous version that movies like Goodfellas show, is just that, a myth. Corinne knows the reality behind the fantasy, and it's far uglier than audiences realized. Yes, there was money. Lots of it, more than most people see in their lifetimes. There were expensive dinners and designer clothes and jewelry and cars and vacations. There was a sense of power, of being special, of operating outside the normal rules that controlled ordinary people. But the price for that lifestyle was enormous. It was constant fear. Fear of arrest, fear of violence, fear of betrayal, fear of your husband being killed or your children being hurt, or your entire world collapsing without warning. It was loneliness, being cut off from anyone outside the mob world, unable to have honest relationships with anyone who didn't understand the life. It was moral compromise, watching violence happen, being involved in crimes, trading your values and integrity for material comfort. And ultimately, it was unsustainable. The mob life doesn't end well for most people who enter it. They die young, killed by rivals or punished for real or imagined betrayals. They spend decades in prison, their lives wasted behind bars. Or, like Henry and Karen, they become informants and spend the rest of their lives in hiding. Ghosts of their former selves, forever looking over their shoulders. Karen has had decades to think about her choices and their consequences. If she could do it all over again, would she make the same decisions? Would she accept that first date with Henry? Would she marry him despite her parents' warnings? Would she stay with him through the arrests and the violence and the affairs? Would she go into witness protection rather than face prison time? These are questions without easy answers. Life isn't a straight path where you can see where each choice will lead at every decision point. Karen made what seemed like the best choice available to her given her circumstances, her knowledge, her options. She was limited by her time period, the 1960s and 1970s, when women had fewer career options and were more economically dependent on their husbands. She was limited by her lack of education and work experience. She was limited by her love for a man who was fundamentally incapable of being what she needed him to be. But she also made choices that reflected her values and her strength. When faced with the decision to go into witness protection, she chose her daughter's welfare over loyalty to the mob code. She chose life over death, survival over pride, adaptation over destruction. Those choices took a different kind of courage than staying silent would have required. The impact on her children is perhaps the heaviest burden she carries. Judy and Ruth, their real names, which they no longer use, grew up in circumstances that no children should have to endure. They witnessed their parents' dysfunction, lived through constant upheaval, absorbed trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. As adults, they wrote a book together called On the Run, A Mafia Childhood, published in 2004, detailing their experiences growing up as Henry Hill's children and living in witness protection. The book provided their perspective on the same events that Goodfellas had dramatized, but from the viewpoint of the innocent victims who'd had no choice in any of it. Reading what her daughters wrote about their childhood was painful for Karen. She saw clearly how her choices had affected them, how the trauma had shaped their development, how they'd struggled with identity and trust and honesty throughout their lives. But she also saw their resilience, their intelligence, their ability to survive and build meaningful lives despite everything they'd been through. They understood, intellectually at least, why she'd made the choices she did. They recognized that going into witness protection had saved the family from either death or decades in prison. But understanding doesn't erase the damage. You can forgive your parents for the circumstances they placed you in while still carrying the scars forever. Karen's story is also the story of the women behind the mobsters, the wives and girlfriends and daughters who lived in the shadow of organized crime without ever being formal members themselves. These women's stories are rarely told in mob movies or true crime books, which tend to focus on the men and their criminal exploits. But the mob wives played essential roles in keeping the criminal organizations going. They provided cover. A criminal with a wife and kids looks more legitimate more like a respectable businessman rather than a gangster. They provided services, passing messages, hiding money or guns, providing alibis, bailing husbands out of jail, maintaining households while the men were in prison. And they paid a price for their closeness to crime. They lived with constant fear. They endured their husbands' unfaithfulness and violence. They raised children in dysfunctional, dangerous environments. They were involved in crimes even when they didn't directly participate. And if their husbands became informants, they paid that price, too, losing their identities, their families, their entire previous lives. Karen was one of the lucky ones in a sense. She survived. Her children survived. They built new lives, however, damaged and limited by witness protection. Many mob wives weren't so fortunate. Some were killed along with their husbands when mob hits went wrong. Some spent years in prison for crimes they'd been forced into participating in. Some fell into addiction or mental illness, unable to cope with the psychological burden of the life, the world of organized crime that Karen entered in 1965 has changed significantly. The old Italian-American mafia families that dominated New York in the 1960s and 1970s have been greatly reduced by successful prosecutions, changing populations, competition from other criminal organizations. Even in witness protection, even supposedly starting over with a clean slate, he couldn't stay out of trouble. He continued using cocaine and drinking heavily. He was arrested multiple times in the 1990s for various offenses: drug possession, drunk driving, assault. Each arrest risked exposing his real identity, risked drawing attention from mob helpers who might still be looking for him. The FBI was losing patience with Henry. Witness protection required following certain rules, and Henry was breaking them constantly. He was supposed to keep a low profile, stay away from criminal activity, not draw law enforcement attention. Instead, he was doing the opposite. There were discussions about kicking him out of the program, leaving him to fend for himself without FBI protection. Karen, even though she was separated from Henry, lived in fear that his recklessness would endanger her and their daughters. If Henry got kicked out of witness protection and the mob found him, would they come looking for the rest of the family too? Would Karen and her daughters pay the price for Henry's inability to follow the rules? She had nightmares about it, waking up to find hitmen at her door. Her daughters being killed because of their father's testimony decades earlier. The past finally catching up to destroy whatever fragile life she'd managed to build. The fear never completely went away. It was always there in the background, a low-grade worry that colored everything. Then, in 1990, something happened that brought all the old trauma rushing back to the surface. The movie Goodfellas was released. Martin Scorsese's film was based on Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy, which was itself based on Henry Hill's life and testimony. Henry had worked extensively with Pileggi for the book, telling his story in detail, providing the inside perspective on mob life that made the book so compelling. Now that story was being adapted for the big screen, with major Hollywood stars playing. Characters based on real people. Ray Liotta played Henry. Hill, Lorraine Bracco played Karen. Hill, Robert De Niro played Jimmy Burke, called Jimmy Conway in the film. Joe Pesci played Tommy DeSimone, called Tommy DeVito in the film. Paul Sorvino played Paul Vario, called Paulie Cicero in the film. Karen went to see the movie in a theater in whatever city she was living in at the time. Sitting in the dark, watching an actress portray her life on screen, it was unreal and disturbing, and strangely relieving all at once. The movie captured some aspects of mob life accurately. The glamour, the camaraderie, the sense of being special. But it also romanticized things, made the violence seem less horrifying than it had been in reality. Compressed decades into 2.5 hours, the famous Copacabana scene was there, the long tracking shot that had become iconic, showing the temptation and excitement of those early days with Henry. The scene with the gun was there, Karen pointing it at Henry's head, the rage and betrayal made visible. The paranoia of the later years was there, the cocaine and the helicopters and the constant fear. But watching someone else play her life was deeply disorienting. Lorraine Bracco's Karen was similar to the real Karen, but also different, a Hollywood version, more dramatic, condensed for story purposes. The real Karen's experience had been more complicated, more contradictory, harder to reduce to a simple story arc. And now her story was public in a way it had never been before. Millions of people would see this movie, would form opinions about Karen Hill, would think they understood her life because they'd watched a film. But they didn't know what it was really like, the day-to-day fear, the loneliness, the impossible choices, the way the mob life hollowed you out from the inside. Goodfellas was a massive critical and commercial success. It was nominated for multiple Academy Awards. It became a cultural touchstone, endlessly quoted and referenced. And at the center of it, however fictionalized, was Karen's life. She had complicated feelings about the movie. Part of her was glad that the story was out there, that people could see what mob life was really like beneath the glamour. But part of her resented having her life turned into entertainment, having her trauma packaged and sold to audiences who would never understand what she'd really experienced. And the movie's success meant increased attention on Henry. He was kicked out of witness protection at some point in the 1990s. Accounts vary on exactly when and why, but his repeated arrests and drug use and inability to keep a low profile eventually exhausted the FBI's patience. Once he was out of the program, he lost his anonymity. Henry started doing interviews, appearing on talk shows, writing books about his mob experiences. He became a minor celebrity in the true crime world, trading on his notoriety, turning his criminal past into a small industry. He gave talks, did podcasts, appeared in documentaries. He seemed to enjoy the attention, to enjoy being known again after years of anonymity and witness protection. For Karen, watching Henry publicly discuss their life together was painful. He talked about things that she'd kept private, shared details about their marriage and their time in the mob that she'd never wanted to be public. He seemed to have no understanding of how his public profile might endanger her and their daughters, who were still in witness protection and still trying to keep their anonymity. But by the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the immediate threat from the mob had lessened somewhat. Paul Vario had died in prison in 1988. Jimmy Burke died in prison in 1996. Many of the other men who'd been part of that world in the 1960s and 1970s were dead or in prison or too old to care about revenge anymore. The new generation of mobsters had their own problems and priorities. The danger hadn't disappeared. Entirely mob memories are long, and there were people who might still want revenge on Henry Hill for his testimony, but the urgency had faded. Karen could breathe a little easier, though she never fully relaxed her watchfulness. The divorce from Henry was finally finalized in 2002. Officially ending a marriage that had begun in 1966 and effectively ended in 1989, 36 years from meeting to final divorce decree, with only about 25 years of actual marriage in between. It had been one of the most important relationships of Karen's life, defining her identity and her experiences in ways that couldn't be undone. After the divorce, Karen continued living in witness protection, keeping her anonymity even as Henry became increasingly public. She rebuilt her life slowly, carefully, one day at a time. She worked, supported herself, stayed in contact with her daughters, tried to find some measure of peace. She dated occasionally, though forming romantic relationships was complicated by her inability to be fully honest about her past. How do you explain to a new partner that you're living under a false name because your ex-husband testified against the mob decades ago? How do you build closeness when you can't share the truth about most of your life? It was one more way that the past interfered with any possibility of a normal future. Karen thought often about the young woman she'd been in 1965, the naive girl who'd fallen for a charming gangster and thought love would be enough. That girl had been hopeful, romantic, convinced that she could handle anything. She'd had no idea what she was signing up for, no idea of how completely the mob life would consume her. If she could go back and talk to that young woman, what would she say? Would she tell her to run, to never accept that first date, to marry some boring accountant and live a safe, predictable suburban life? Or would she acknowledge that maybe there was no way to avoid the path she'd taken, that some lessons can only be learned through experience, that regret changes nothing? The truth was complicated. Karen had experienced things that most people never would, the heights of glamour and the depths of fear, intimate knowledge of a criminal underworld that most people only saw in movies, survival through situations that would have destroyed many others. She'd raised 2 daughters through impossible circumstances and lived to tell about it, even if she couldn't tell most of it to most people. She'd paid an enormous price for her choices, her identity, her family connections, her freedom to live openly under her real name. Decades of fear and loneliness and psychological trauma. But she'd survived. That had to count for something. As the 2000s progressed and Karen entered her 60s, she achieved something she'd never had in her younger years: stability. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a young woman. And it certainly wasn't the glamorous existence she'd had as a mob wife in the 1960s and 1970s, but it was hers. Built by her own hands, based on legal work and honest relationships, as honest as someone in witness protection could have. She had friendships, though they were limited by her inability to share her full history. She had hobbies and interests. She had her daughters and eventually grandchildren, a new generation who would grow up not knowing the full truth about their grandmother's past. At least not for many years. The grandchildren represented hope to Karen. They were innocent, untouched by the mob world, growing up in legitimate families with honest careers. They would never have to look over their shoulders or live under false names. The cycle had been broken. The connection to the criminal underworld severed. Whatever wrongs Karen had committed or been involved in, at least they wouldn't be passed down to another generation. Henry continued his public life. Throughout the 2000s,